The night my son decided I wasn't worth opening the front door for, I was standing in the rain with a suitcase that held everything I still owned in this world. I could see him through the glass. He could see me, and he didn't move. That moment right there, in the wet dark outside a 4-bedroom house in Dunwoody, Georgia, that I helped him buy, that is where this story really begins. Not at the bankruptcy, not at the business collapse. Right there, at that door, with the rain coming down and my son choosing to stay on the other side of the glass. He had no idea what was already in motion. Neither did I. My name is Walter Grimes, and I am 63 years old, and I spent 38 years building something real in Atlanta. Grimes, structural, commercial construction, industrial builds, long-term contracts with developers across the metro area. I started it with $7,000, a borrowed truck, and hands that knew how to work before my mind knew how to manage. By the time it was done, I employed 41 people. I had a pension. I had a house in Smyrna. I had a son named Marcus, who I sent to Georgia Tech, and who never once had to wonder whether the lights would stay on. I gave him everything I never had. I want you to remember that, because everything that comes after depends on you understanding what I put into that boy's life. The collapse came in 72 hours. That's not an exaggeration. 3 major clients pulled contracts simultaneously, citing phantom violations that my attorney said he'd never seen cited before. The bank called in a line of credit we'd held for 11 years without a single missed payment. Then my insurance provider, a company I had been with for 14 years, voided 2 of my core policies, claiming procedural errors in filings that had never been questioned before. My attorney looked at me across a conference table on a Wednesday morning and said, "Walter, I don't understand how all of this happened at once. I didn't either. Not yet." Within a week, I had nothing. The house went in the asset seizure. My personal vehicle, a pickup I'd owned for 6 years, was repossessed. I had a 2009 Buick LeSabre that was technically my ex-wife's before she passed, which no one thought to take because it wasn't registered to the business. That Buick became my home. I packed what I could into 2 bags and a laundry basket, and I drove it to Marcus's neighborhood, and I sat outside his house at 9 o'clock at night trying to figure out how to knock on the door of someone who used to be my child. I want to be honest with you about what that felt like, because I think a lot of people would gloss over this part. There is a specific kind of shame that lives in a man who has provided all his life and suddenly cannot provide for himself. It is not the same as regular embarrassment. It is deeper. It sits in your chest like a stone. I sat in that Buick for 45 minutes before I could get out. I kept thinking, he's going to open the door. He's my son. Of course he's going to open the door. I raised him. He knows who I am. He knows what I sacrificed. He didn't open the door. I knocked, and I could see through the sidelight panel that Marcus was in the dining room with his wife, Celeste, and they both looked up and saw me. Marcus's face did something I had never seen it do before. It went flat, deliberate, like he was deciding something right there at the table. Celeste got up first. She walked to the door but kept her hand on the deadbolt. She spoke through the glass. "Walter, we heard what happened. I'm sorry, but we can't take this on right now." I pressed my palm flat against the doorframe. I said, "Celeste, I'm not asking you to take anything on. I need a couch for a few nights. That's it." She shook her head. Her voice was perfectly calm. "That's not something we're in a position to offer." And then Marcus appeared behind her. My son. The boy whose Little League games I coached. The boy I drove 4 hours to Athens every time he had a rough semester at college because I didn't want him to feel alone. He stood behind his wife and said, "Dad, maybe you should look into what Fulton County has for emergency housing. They have resources for situations like yours, situations like mine." I stared at him and tried to find the person I raised inside that face. I couldn't locate him. "Marcus," I said, and I hated how my voice broke. "I'm your father." He said, "I know. I'm sorry, Dad." And then he put his hand on Celeste's shoulder, and they both walked back toward the kitchen. The lights in the front of the house went off one by one. I stood at that door for another 10 minutes. I don't know why. Some part of me believed he would come back. He didn't. I made it to the Buick before I started crying. 63 years old, sitting in a dead woman's car in the rain outside my son's house, weeping in a way I hadn't wept since I was a child. And somewhere underneath the grief there was something cold beginning to form. Not rage. Not yet. Something harder than rage. A question. How does a man get here? How does a child turn into that? I didn't have the answer. Not that night. I drove to a Home Depot parking lot on Cobb Parkway and parked between 2 contractor vans where I figured nobody would bother me. October in Atlanta is cold at night, and the Buick's heater worked inconsistently. I had a sweatshirt, a sport coat, and a blanket from the laundry basket, and I layered all three and still shivered until somewhere around 2 a.m. when my body gave up fighting and just slept. I dreamed about the Morrison warehouse job, 2009, the one that put Grimes Structural on the map. I dreamed about standing on the 8th floor of that building watching the Atlanta skyline and thinking, I built something. It exists. Nobody can take it. Then I woke up at 5:17 inches the morning to a knock on my passenger window. I bolted upright, convinced it was security. What I saw instead was a man in a dark wool uniform standing very still beside a car that had absolutely no business being in a Home Depot parking lot. It was a Bentley Flying Spur, navy blue, idling quietly. The man knocked again, politely, and when I rolled down the window he said, "Excuse me, sir, are you Walter Grimes?" I stared at him. I said, "Who's asking?" He said, "My name is Leonard. I work for a man named Cornelius Tate. Mr. Tate has been trying to find you for the past 11 days. He's in Northside Hospital's private ward, and he says he needs you there before he passes. He says it concerns his will, and that time is running very short. I want you to sit with what I felt in that moment, because it is almost impossible to describe. 2 days of absolute devastation, of being stripped of every shred of dignity, of crying in a parking lot, and now a man in a Bentley was in the dark, telling me that someone I hadn't thought about in decades needed me specifically, not my attorney. Not a family member. Me, Cornelius Tate. The name surfaced slowly, the way things do when you haven't touched them in a long time. He had been my site supervisor at Landover and Associates back when I was 24 years old, green and broke and grateful for any steady work. He was a commanding man. Precise. Fair in a way that was rarer than it should have been in that industry. I had worked under him for about 18 months before I started striking out on my own. I hadn't spoken to him since the mid-1980s. He had to be in his late 80s by now, maybe older. I looked down at myself. I hadn't showered in 2 days. My clothes were slept in. Leonard, to his enormous credit, simply said, "Mr. Tate specifically told me that your circumstances wouldn't matter. He asked me to bring you as you are." Something about the gentleness of that broke through the numbness. I said yes. The private ward at Northside was a different world from every other part of that hospital, hushed, warm, carpeted in the hallways. Leonard brought me to a room at the end of a corridor and knocked softly. A voice from inside said, "Bring him in." Cornelius Tate was ancient now, reduced in frame, but not in presence. Those eyes, the same sharp, measuring eyes I remembered from construction sites 40 years ago, found me immediately and lit up with something I can only describe as relief. "Walter," he said, "you came." I sat down in the chair beside him because I didn't know what else to do. "Mr. Tate," I said, "I have to tell you I don't understand any of this." He smiled. He said, "I know. We have a lot to cover, and I need you to listen before you react." And then Cornelius Tate began to talk. He told me that he had been watching me from a distance for almost 4 decades. I felt something cold move through me. He said he had been a silent partner in Grimes, structural at various points, small investments, anonymous loan guarantees during cash-tight years, contracts steered my way through intermediaries when I needed them most. I thought about the Hargrove Technologies contract in 2011, the one that came out of nowhere and kept 23 people employed through the recession. He nodded before I could even say it out loud. "I recommended you personally," he said, "but Walter, you earned every dollar of that work. All I did was make the introduction." "Why?" I asked. He said, "Because you saved my life." The 9th of December 1983. The Caldwell Avenue project. Do you remember? And then I did. A crane cable had snapped during a lift on the 6th floor. Cornelius had been standing directly below, reviewing schematics, completely unaware. I had been walking behind him with a load of rebar, and I saw it maybe a full second before it hit, and I tackled him sideways without thinking. The beam came down where he had been standing and left a crater in the concrete. Neither of us said much about it afterward. I remember thinking it wasn't remarkable. Any man would have done the same. I had forgotten about it within a week. Cornelius Tate had not forgotten about it in 40 years. "I went on to build Tate Development Group," he said quietly. 14 properties across the Southeast. Commercial real estate, mixed-use developments, industrial parks. The company is currently valued at somewhere above $700 million. I stared at him. He said, "All of it exists because you were paying attention on a job site in 1983. I have never once taken that for granted. I didn't know what to say to that. Honestly, and I want to be real with you here, I didn't feel gratitude in that moment. I felt a disorienting vertigo, like the ground was moving beneath me." Because Cornelius wasn't done. He reached for a folder on his bedside table with trembling hands and said, "Walter, your company didn't fail. It was taken apart. Deliberately. By someone who knew every vulnerability it had." He opened the folder. The first page had my son's name on it, and his signature. I am not going to pretend I believed him immediately. I pushed back. I told him Marcus had problems, but he wasn't capable of something like that. Cornelius let me talk. Then he started laying documents on the bed between us, one at a time, the way a card player lays down a hand he's been holding all night. A contract between Marcus and one of my largest former clients, Halcyon Properties, signed 8 months before my collapse, agreeing to provide confidential, operational, and financial data about Grimes Structural in exchange for payment. A letter Marcus had sent to my insurance provider, on letterhead he had no right to possess, detailing fabricated safety violations and falsified inspection records. Bank statements showing a pattern of small, irregular withdrawals from my business accounts going back 3 years, all routed through a software system Marcus had personally installed and told me would modernize my bookkeeping. He stole from me while teaching me how to use the tool he used to steal. I sat there and felt something happen inside my chest that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't rage. It was something more total than rage. It was the collapse of a version of reality I had been living inside for years. Every Sunday dinner. Every conversation where Marcus asked about upcoming bids, and I answered openly because I was proud he was interested. Every time I thought he was finally becoming curious about the business I built, he was mining me. I was the source, and he was the excavation. Cornelius said, "He also sold bid information to your competitors. There is evidence that he received fee payments from at least 4 companies who used your own data to undercut you on contracts you should have won." He pulled out one more document, the one that made the room go quiet around me, and placed it on top of the others. It was a power of attorney form with my name on it. My signature. Except I had never signed it. If you have ever discovered that someone who loved you was building a trap while you were building a life, if you have ever realized that the person you trusted most had a different version of you in mind, one that was useful rather than beloved, then you understand what I felt reading that document. You understand the specific horror of seeing your own name on something designed to erase you. Their plan, Cornelius explained, was to wait until I was destitute enough to accept help on any terms. Then they would offer to take me in, provide for my basic needs, and ask me to sign over the ability to manage my affairs. Once they had legal authority, they would pursue a conservatorship, have me evaluated, have me declared unable to manage my own finances. I would live in their spare bedroom, dependent on them for everything, while they controlled my social security, my life insurance, and any residual assets from the bankruptcy. I thought about Celeste at that door, calm as still water, telling me to look into Fulton County emergency housing. I understood now what she was doing. She was making sure I got desperate enough. Cornelius reached for a final envelope on the nightstand and held it out to me with both hands. He said, "I'm dying, Walter, probably within the next few days, and I am at peace with that. I have arranged my affairs carefully. My own children and I say this without self-pity. Just as fact have spent years treating me like a retirement account. I love them. But they are not good people." He pressed the envelope into my hands. "You are. You always have been. And I need a man of integrity to witness what I've decided." He left everything to me. The will reading 3 days after his funeral was one of the strangest experiences of my life. I sat at a conference table across from 3 of Cornelius Tate's adult children and their attorneys, and I watched their faces as the estate attorney read each line. The eldest daughter, Diane, went pale when she heard her name followed by a $1 bequest. His son, Raymond Jr., slammed both hands on the table. The youngest, Priya, began sobbing in a way that was more fury than grief. Their attorneys immediately began murmuring about challenges, about mental competency evaluations, about undue influence. I sat quietly and let them talk. Cornelius had spent his final months bulletproofing every clause in that document. The challenges failed in court within 8 weeks. I moved into a hotel in Buckhead while the estate transferred. I didn't touch a cent for the first month. I needed time to think. I needed to decide what kind of man I was going to be with power I had never asked for and never expected. That's when Cornelius's estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, called me with something I hadn't known. She said, "Mr. Grimes, there are additional assets." Mr. Tate began acquiring certain holdings in the months before he passed. Holdings he described as tools, not trophies. He had purchased the mortgage on Marcus and Celeste's house in Dunwoody. He had acquired the debt on 3 of their largest credit accounts. He had bought the financing on both of their vehicles. Everything they owed to anyone who mattered, they now technically owed to me. Patricia said, "He left instructions. He called it the geometry of justice." He believed that the right response to betrayal was not destruction, but accountability. He hoped you would agree. I drove to Dunwoody and sat across the street from that house for a long time. I looked at the front door, the one that hadn't opened for me 2 months earlier. I thought about the Buick, and the rain, and the stone in my chest that had been there ever since. I thought about what I could do. Foreclose. Call in the debts. Send the evidence to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, and let the criminal process take everything from Marcus the way he had tried to take everything from me. I had the legal right. I had the moral justification. Part of me, the part that remembered standing in that rain, wanted to use it. I didn't. I called Patricia and I said, set up a meeting, their house, tomorrow evening. Tell them their mortgage servicer needs to review some account irregularities. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Cornelius thought you might do it this way. He told me if Walter chooses mercy over punishment, help him do it right. The next evening, I sat in Marcus and Celeste's living room for the first time in 5 years. They didn't recognize me at first. I was wearing a suit, I was clean, I was calm, and Patricia had introduced me simply as the representative of the new holding company that owned their loan. I watched them perform anxiety for a mortgage meeting, explaining their payment history, their credit profile, their stability. Celeste's voice had that careful, constructed reasonableness I remembered from the glass door. Marcus was trying his salesman calm. Then I said his name. Just his name, Marcus. He stopped talking. He looked at me the way you look at something you didn't expect to be alive. The color left his face like a tide going out. Dad, he whispered. Hello, son, I said. We need to talk. I want to slow this moment down for you, because it is the one I think about most. The room went completely silent. Celeste's hand was over her mouth. Marcus was staring at me like I was a reappearance, which, I suppose, I was. Patricia opened her briefcase and began laying documents on their coffee table, one at a time. The mortgage transfer, the debt acquisitions, the investigation file, the forged power of attorney, the recorded communications Cornelius's investigators had gathered over months of surveillance. Everything, in sequence, in plain language, on their coffee table in the house they thought was theirs. I didn't yell. I had made a decision, sitting in the Buick, that first night. If I ever got the chance to speak to Marcus about this, I would not perform anger. Anger was what he had probably prepared for. I was going to make him sit inside the truth instead. I walked him through every document, every stolen invoice, every sold bid, every forged signature, the conservatorship plan, all of it. I watched his face move through denial and then calculation and then, somewhere around the forged power of attorney, something that might have been the first genuine shame I had ever seen him feel as an adult. Celeste tried to negotiate before he finished processing. We'll pay you back, she said. Every penny, with interest. I said, this isn't a negotiation, Celeste. It's a conversation. I turned back to Marcus. I need you to tell me something true. Did you believe I deserved this? He couldn't answer right away. I waited. Finally, in a voice I barely recognized, he said, I thought you'd never notice. I don't know what I thought, Dad. I thought we needed it more than you did. And there it was. Not evil, entitlement. The belief that his need was larger than my labor. The belief that my life's work was really just a resource waiting for redistribution. I said, I know. And I think you believe that completely. I think somewhere along the way, you and Celeste built a story where you were the deserving people and I was just the obstacle. I think that story felt true to you. He was crying now. Not performing, actually crying. The way people cry when the version of themselves they thought they were stops being available to them. I let him. Then I said, I have 2 options to offer you. I laid out the first one plainly. Criminal referral for fraud, forgery, and financial theft. Immediate foreclosure. Full collection proceedings on all outstanding debt. Federal and state exposure, given the interstate elements of some of the client contracts he had interfered with. His attorney, when he got one, would not be optimistic. The second option, a structured accountability agreement. Sell the house, move into something modest, surrender the lease vehicles and buy used, submit to monthly financial reporting for 20 years, contribute 60% of all income above basic living costs toward documented restitution, and write me a handwritten letter every single month, not an email, a letter, by hand explaining what they were learning, what consequences felt like from the inside, what they understood about what they had taken. If you complete it, I said, I will forgive the debt, and we will attempt, I do not promise, to see if there is still something between us worth calling a family. Marcus picked up the contract. He read it twice, Celeste read it once, quickly, looking for an exit clause that wasn't there. Then Marcus picked up the pen Patricia had set on the table and signed his name. Celeste signed beneath his. He didn't say anything when he handed it back. But when I stood up to leave, he said, "Quietly, Dad, I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I know you are. Start from there. If you have ever had to decide whether to destroy someone who deserved it or build something more difficult than destruction, I hope you understand what that choice costs. Revenge is easy. You just have to be willing to become the kind of person who does it. Justice, real justice, the kind that requires the person who hurt you to actually understand what they did, that takes more strength than I knew I had. I'm not telling you I made the noble choice. I'm telling you I made the only choice I could live inside." 6 months later, I was sitting on the deck of a house I bought on Lake Allatoona, north of Atlanta, watching the morning fog lift off the water. Not a mansion. A house. Something I could feel in proportion to a human life. I had used a portion of the inheritance to quietly rehire 11 of my former Grimes structural employees who hadn't landed on their feet after the collapse. I wasn't rebuilding the company. That chapter was closed, but I wasn't going to let people who depended on me disappear without a bridge. Marcus's first letter arrived in January. It was 3 paragraphs. Stiff. Careful. Like a man writing to someone he was afraid of. By March, the letters were longer. By June, he was writing things like, "I keep trying to figure out what made me think your life was something I was owed. I don't have a clean answer yet. I think I was ashamed of where I came from, and it was easier to be angry at you than to be ashamed of myself." That letter I read twice, not because it made everything better, because it told me that somewhere inside Marcus, the person I raised was still present. Damaged, distorted, but present. I don't know what we'll be to each other in 20 years. I don't know if what he broke between us can be fully rebuilt. But I know that on the night I stood in the rain outside his front door with nowhere left to go, I could not have imagined that 8 months later I would be reading his handwriting over coffee by a Georgia lake, understanding for the first time in decades what peace actually felt like. Not happiness. Peace. Those are different things. Happiness depends on what's happening around you. Peace is something you carry. Cornelius Tate left me a fortune. But the real thing he left me was a model for what a life could look like when you never let your grievances turn you into someone smaller than your values. He spent 40 years quietly helping the man who saved him. Not because it was transactional, but because he believed that generosity was its own form of integrity. I think about that every day. I try to earn it. This story taught me that the people who betray you are usually not monsters. They are people who told themselves a story that made the betrayal feel justified, even necessary. Understanding that doesn't mean forgiving it. It means you can make your response proportionate to the truth, rather than to your pain. It means you get to decide what happens next instead of just reacting to what happened before. The self-reflection question I'll leave with you is this. Is there somewhere in your life where you've decided someone else's resources are more rightfully yours than theirs? Not because you're Marcus, but because all of us, in small ways, have told versions of that story at some point. It's worth sitting with. Now I want to ask you something directly. Comment below. Would you have chosen the accountability agreement, or would you have gone straight to the DA? Type 1 if you would have offered the choice, type 2 if you would have called the DA, and type 3 if you don't know yet because you're still figuring out who you'd be in that situation. I genuinely want to know. And tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there. This story started in Atlanta, but it clearly belongs to more places than one. If you've ever been turned away by someone who should have been your safe harbor, tell me that too. You don't have to say more than that. I'll understand. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. I tell stories because I believe that what happens to real people, even versions of real people, even the fictional shapes real grief takes, deserves to be told carefully and fully, without rushing toward the ending. Thank you for staying until this one. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined, set in Atlanta, Georgia, to create entirely original content. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or to real events, is entirely coincidental.